Look, I never thought I'd be writing this on Reddit, but I need to get this off my chest because what happened with my family has completely blown up my world. Some background. I'm 34, divorced 3 years ago from my ex-wife Linda. No kids of my own, which honestly was probably for the best given how that marriage ended. Linda has a daughter, Riley, from her first marriage. She was 14 when Linda and I got together, 19 now. I genuinely thought of Riley as my niece, even though technically she wasn't blood family. When Linda and I split, I figured I'd lost any connection to Riley, but the kid reached out to me directly about 6 months later. Riley had always been academically gifted, like scary smart. While Linda and I were married, I helped with homework, drove her to academic competitions, and basically became the stable father figure she never had. Her biological dad, Dennis, was in and out of the picture, mostly out. When Riley contacted me after the divorce, she said I was the only adult who'd ever actually supported her education and dreams. Here's where it gets complicated. Riley wanted to apply to Harvard. Her grades were perfect, test scores through the roof. But Linda was struggling financially after our divorce. Dennis was completely unreliable for any kind of support. Riley asked if I could help with application fees and maybe contribute to tuition if she got in. She was genuinely terrified she'd have to give up her dreams because of money. I said yes immediately. Look, I made good money in tech consulting, had no other dependents, and I genuinely cared about this kid's future. We worked out a plan where I'd cover application costs up front, and if she got into Harvard, I'd pay for her housing and a significant chunk of tuition. We're talking about $280,000 over 4 years. Riley was incredibly grateful and promised she'd pay me back someday when she became a successful lawyer. The Harvard acceptance letter came in March. Riley called me crying with joy, thanking me over and over. Linda even called to thank me, though she seemed uncomfortable about it. Dennis was suddenly very interested in Riley's life again once Harvard was involved. That's when things started getting weird. Riley began posting constantly on Instagram about getting into Harvard, but never mentioned how she was paying for it. When people asked, she'd just say her family was helping. Fine, I didn't need credit. But then I started noticing she was introducing herself differently at family gatherings and school events. The first red flag was at Linda's mother's birthday dinner in April. I was still invited to family stuff because honestly, Linda's family liked me better than they liked Dennis. Riley was talking to her cousin about Harvard, and when the cousin asked how she was affording it, Riley said her real family was taking care of everything. She looked directly at Dennis when she said it. Dennis had literally contributed nothing to Riley's education ever. The guy couldn't even remember to pay child support consistently. But suddenly he was taking credit for Riley's success. When I tried to join the conversation, Riley got this weird look and said something about how some people try to buy their way into families where they don't belong. I figured it was just teenage weirdness mixed with stress about starting college. Riley had been through a lot with the divorce and everything, but it kept happening. At her graduation party in June, multiple relatives congratulated Dennis on doing such a great job supporting Riley's education. He just smiled and accepted the praise. When someone asked me how I felt about Riley going to Harvard, she interrupted and said I probably wouldn't understand since I wasn't really family. That stung, but I still didn't want to cause drama at her graduation. I pulled Riley aside later and asked if everything was okay between us. She gave me this cold look and said she was just being honest about our relationship. According to her, I was Linda's ex-husband who was trying to stay relevant by throwing money around. She said it was kind of pathetic that I was so desperate to feel like part of a family that wasn't mine. The real explosion came in July. Riley was posting constantly about Harvard prep, shopping for dorm stuff, talking about how excited she was. All normal stuff. But then she made this Instagram post that just destroyed me. It was a photo of her acceptance letter with a long caption about how grateful she was to her real family for believing in her. She specifically thanked her amazing mom and her father who never gave up on her, meaning Dennis. Then came the part that made me see red. She wrote, "Special shout out to everyone who supported me authentically, not just people trying to buy their way into our family. Real love can't be purchased." The post got dozens of comments from family and friends congratulating Dennis and Linda for their sacrifice and investment in Riley's future. I was furious, not just because I wasn't getting credit, but because she was actively rewriting history. Dennis had been absent for most of Riley's life. Linda was working 2 jobs just to keep up with basic expenses. I was the one who'd spent countless evenings helping with homework, driving to debate tournaments, and now funding her entire Harvard education. But what really broke me was realizing that Riley genuinely saw me as some creepy guy trying to buy family affection. In her mind, I wasn't someone who cared about her success. I was a pathetic divorce with no kids of my own, desperately trying to stay connected to my ex-wife's family by throwing money around. I decided to have one final conversation with Riley before making any decisions. I called her in early August and asked to meet for coffee. She reluctantly agreed, but made it clear she was busy with college prep. When I tried to explain how hurt I was by her posts and comments, she got defensive immediately. Riley told me I was being manipulative by bringing up money. She said I was trying to guilt trip her into performing gratitude just because I had helped financially. According to her, my support came with too many strings attached. I expected to be treated like family when I wasn't. She said Dennis might not have money, but he was her actual father and deserved recognition for being there for her. When I pointed out that Dennis had been largely absent and I'd been the one actually supporting her education for years, Riley exploded. She accused me of trying to replace her real father and said it was creepy and inappropriate that I was so invested in her life. She said Linda had always been uncomfortable with how attached I was to Riley, and that my continued involvement after the divorce proved I had boundary issues. The conversation ended with Riley telling me she didn't want my money if it came with expectations of gratitude or family inclusion. She said she'd rather take out loans than deal with my emotional manipulation. She literally called me a wannabe dad who was using financial support to force a relationship that didn't exist. I sat in that coffee shop for an hour after she left, trying to process what had just happened. This kid I genuinely loved and supported had just told me I was essentially a creepy outsider who'd been buying affection. According to her version of events, I was the problem. Not Dennis, who'd abandoned his responsibilities. Not Linda, who couldn't afford to support her daughter's dreams, but me, for stepping up when no one else would. That night, I made the decision I've been wrestling with ever since. I logged into my bank account and canceled the automatic payment plan I'd set up for Riley's Harvard expenses. I withdrew the $15,000 housing deposit I'd already submitted. I sent a formal email to Harvard's financial aid office stating that I would no longer be sponsoring Riley's education. Then I called Riley and told her what I'd done. I explained that since she saw my support as manipulation and preferred to handle things with her real family, she was free to do exactly that. I wished her luck at Harvard and told her not to contact me again. The phone went silent for about 30 seconds. Then Riley started screaming that I couldn't just abandon her 6 weeks before school started. She said I was proving her point about being manipulative by withdrawing support the moment she didn't show enough gratitude. She called me vindictive and said I was destroying her future out of spite. I told her I wasn't destroying anything. I was simply respecting her wishes to handle her education through her real family. If Dennis was such a wonderful father and Linda was so supportive, surely they could figure out how to fund Harvard without the creepy ex-husband's help. Riley hung up on me. 5 minutes later, Linda called screaming about how I was punishing a child for being honest about our relationship. She said I was being petty and vindictive, that Riley was just a teenager who didn't understand the implications of what she was saying. Linda begged me to reconsider, saying Riley's entire future was at stake. I told Linda the same thing I'd told Riley. If I was just a pathetic ex-husband trying to buy family affection, then the family could solve this problem without me. Riley had made it clear she'd rather take loans than accept support with strings attached, so I was helping her achieve that independence. Dennis called me 2 days later. Suddenly, the absent father was very concerned about his daughter's education. He accused me of being psychotic and vengeful, said I was taking out my divorce anger on an innocent kid. He demanded I restore the funding immediately and said he'd take legal action if I didn't. I laughed and told Dennis he was welcome to take legal action, but there was no law requiring me to fund someone else's education. I suggested he step up and be the father Riley claimed he'd always been. Dennis started screaming about how I'd manipulated his daughter by offering financial support, then abandoned her when she didn't worship me enough. That was 2 weeks ago. I've been getting texts and calls from various family members telling me I'm being unreasonable and cruel. Linda's sister called me a bitter old man who was destroying a child's dreams out of wounded pride. Riley's cousin said I was proving I never really cared about Riley if I could abandon her so easily. But here's what's really eating at me. None of them are wrong about one thing. I am hurt that Riley saw my support as manipulation rather than genuine care. I am angry that Dennis gets credit for being her father while doing nothing, while I get labeled as a creepy outsider for actually helping. I am bitter that years of genuine relationship and support meant so little to Riley that she could dismiss me as a wannabe dad buying affection. Maybe that makes me petty. Maybe I should have just accepted that Riley saw our relationship differently and continued supporting her education anyway. But I couldn't handle being treated like some pathetic hanger-on who was trying to purchase family love, especially when the alternative was watching Dennis get praised for Riley's success while contributing nothing. Riley's supposed to start at Harvard in 3 weeks. As far as I know, Linda and Dennis haven't figured out how to replace my funding. Part of me feels terrible that I might be destroying this kid's dreams over hurt feelings. But another part of me thinks Riley needed to learn that actions have consequences. And you can't publicly humiliate someone while expecting them to continue funding your life. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if Riley will find a way to make Harvard work or if she'll have to defer and go somewhere more affordable. I don't know if I'm the villain in this story or if I finally stood up for myself after being taken advantage of. What I do know is that I'm done being treated like a desperate outsider trying to buy his way into a family. Riley wanted her real family to handle her education. Now they can. Update 1. The response to my original post was overwhelming. Thank you to everyone who said I wasn't crazy for feeling hurt and angry. Some of you called me petty. And honestly, maybe you're right. But after what happened this week, I'm starting to think this whole situation runs way deeper than I originally understood. So where I left off, I had withdrawn Riley's Harvard funding after she publicly called me a manipulative wannabe dad who was trying to buy family affection. Riley, Linda, and Dennis were all furious. The extended family was taking sides. Harvard classes start in 10 days, and as far as I knew, nobody had figured out how to replace the $280,000 I'd promised. What I didn't expect was the absolute chaos that would follow. It started Tuesday morning when Linda showed up at my apartment. Not called, not texted, just showed up at 7 a.m. banging on my door. I opened it to find her standing there with red eyes and mascara streaks down her face. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Linda immediately started talking about how I was destroying Riley's entire future over hurt feelings. She said Riley was just a scared teenager who didn't understand the implications of what she was saying. According to Linda, Riley had been getting pressure from Dennis to distance herself from me ever since the Harvard acceptance came through. Dennis apparently told Riley that it looked bad for him as her father if she was too grateful to her mom's ex-husband. This was the first I'd heard about Dennis actively working against me. Linda explained that Dennis had been telling Riley for months that my involvement in her life was inappropriate and confusing. He convinced Riley that accepting my support made him look like a failure as a father. Dennis apparently said that if Riley really loved and respected him, she'd find a way to pay for college without help from the man who replaced him in her mom's bed. Linda begged me to understand that Riley's Instagram posts and comments weren't really her feelings. They were her trying to protect Dennis's ego and prove her loyalty to him as her real father. She said Riley actually appreciated everything I'd done, but felt caught between gratitude to me and loyalty to Dennis. I told Linda that was a nice theory, but Riley had been plenty clear about how she saw our relationship. She called me manipulative and creepy. She said I had boundary issues. Those weren't Dennis's words coming out of her mouth. Those were her genuine feelings about me. Linda got defensive and said I was being unreasonable. She insisted that Riley was just confused and scared, that I should be the bigger person and restore the funding. She said I was punishing Riley for Dennis's manipulation and teenage confusion. I asked Linda directly why she never shut down Dennis's campaign against me, why she let him poison Riley against someone who was genuinely trying to help. Linda got quiet and admitted she thought it might be easier if Riley wasn't so attached to me. She said it was complicated having her daughter be closer to her ex-husband than to her actual father. That admission hit me hard. Linda had been allowing Dennis to undermine me because it simplified her life. She was okay with Riley rejecting my support as long as it meant less drama with Dennis. But now that the money was gone and Riley's future was in jeopardy, suddenly Linda wanted me to be understanding about the whole situation. Our conversation lasted 2 hours and got heated multiple times. Linda accused me of being vindictive and punishing a child for adult problems. I told her she was rewriting history. Riley was 19 years old and perfectly capable of taking responsibility for her words and actions. Linda said I was being cruel by abandoning Riley when she needed me most. I said I was finally respecting Riley's stated wishes about our relationship. The conversation ended with Linda crying and saying she didn't know how to fix this. She admitted that neither she nor Dennis could come up with anything close to the money needed for Harvard. Dennis had promised Riley he'd figure something out, but Linda knew he was just buying time and hoping I'd cave under family pressure. 2 days later, Dennis showed up. Unlike Linda's emotional breakdown, Dennis came in hot and aggressive from the start. He accused me of deliberately sabotaging his relationship with his daughter by offering financial support that made him look inadequate. According to Dennis, I had manipulated the whole situation to make myself look like the hero, while making him look like a deadbeat. Dennis said he'd been working to repair his relationship with Riley for years, and my involvement had undermined every effort he made. He claimed that Riley only saw him as a failure, because I was always there being the reliable provider and father figure. Dennis insisted that if I really cared about Riley, I would have stepped back and let him handle his responsibilities as her father. I pointed out that Dennis had been largely absent from Riley's life and had contributed almost nothing to her education or college planning. Dennis exploded and said that was because I had inserted myself into situations where I didn't belong. He claimed that Riley never gave him a chance to step up because I was always jumping in first with my wallet open. This conversation revealed something I hadn't fully understood before. Dennis genuinely resented me not just for being with Linda, but for being the father to Riley that he'd never managed to be. In his mind, I had stolen his role and then used money to make it permanent. Dennis saw my educational support as a deliberate strategy to replace him in Riley's life. Dennis demanded that I restore Riley's funding and then back off completely from her life. He said if I really cared about Riley's success, I'd pay for Harvard and then disappear so she could have a normal relationship with her actual father. He actually said I should fund her education anonymously so she wouldn't feel obligated to maintain contact with me. I told Dennis that ship had sailed. Riley had made it clear she saw my support as manipulation and wanted her real family to handle her education. I was simply giving her what she asked for. Dennis called me petty and vindictive, said I was destroying Riley's future to hurt him. But here's what really got to me during that conversation. Dennis admitted he'd been actively working to turn Riley against me since the day she got into Harvard. He'd spent months telling her that accepting my money would damage her relationship with him and make her dependent on someone outside the family. Dennis had convinced Riley that the healthy thing was to reject my support and prove she could succeed through her real family connections. Dennis had orchestrated Riley's rejection of me. Those Instagram posts calling me manipulative weren't teenage confusion. They were the result of months of Dennis convincing Riley that my support came with inappropriate strings attached. He'd systematically poisoned our relationship and then convinced Riley it was her idea to distance herself from me. Learning this made me even more determined not to restore the funding. Dennis had gotten exactly what he wanted. Riley choosing him over me, rejecting my involvement in her life, and publicly stating that I wasn't real family. The only problem was that Dennis couldn't actually replace what he'd convinced Riley to reject. Yesterday was when things got really intense. Riley herself showed up at my office. She'd never done that before, and it felt like a major escalation. Riley looked exhausted and stressed, but was trying to maintain some dignity. She asked if we could talk privately about the Harvard situation. Riley started by saying she understood why I was hurt by her comments, but that I was overreacting by destroying her future. She said she never meant to imply that I was a bad person, just that she needed to prioritize her relationship with her actual father. Riley insisted that she appreciated everything I'd done, but that accepting my continued support would damage her family relationships. I told Riley that I understood her position perfectly, which was why I was respecting her decision to handle her education through her real family. Riley got frustrated and said I was being deliberately obtuse. She said there was a difference between not wanting to feel obligated to me and not wanting my help at all. Riley tried to negotiate some kind of middle ground where I would restore the funding, but she wouldn't feel pressured to maintain a relationship with me afterward. She suggested that I could pay for Harvard as a final gift, and then we could go our separate ways cleanly. Riley said this would let her succeed without feeling indebted to someone outside her immediate family. I asked Riley if she understood what she was proposing. She wanted me to spend $280,000 on her education and then disappear from her life so she could have an uncomplicated relationship with Dennis. She was asking me to fund her dreams and then accept permanent exile from the family I'd been part of for 8 years. Riley said that might sound harsh, but it was the most honest solution. She admitted that Dennis felt threatened by my involvement in her life and that maintaining a relationship with me would create ongoing family drama. Riley said she'd rather sacrifice our relationship than risk damaging her connection with her actual father. Hearing Riley lay it out so clearly was both devastating and clarifying. She understood exactly what she was asking for. Riley wanted me to pay for her success and then voluntarily remove myself so she could have the family dynamic she preferred. It wasn't teenage confusion or Dennis's manipulation. It was Riley making a calculated choice about which relationships mattered more to her. I told Riley no. If she wanted Dennis to be her primary father figure and handle her major life decisions, then Dennis could handle the financial responsibilities that came with that role. I wasn't going to fund her education just to be discarded afterward. Riley got angry and said I was proving her point about my support coming with strings attached. She said if I really cared about her success, I wouldn't make it conditional on maintaining a relationship with me. Riley accused me of using money to force emotional connections that she didn't want. I told Riley she was right. that my support came with expectations. I expected basic respect and acknowledgement of our relationship. I expected not to be publicly dismissed as a manipulative outsider. I expected that someone accepting my financial support wouldn't work actively to exclude me from family events and decisions. Riley said those expectations were exactly the problem. She said accepting my money felt like accepting an obligation to perform gratitude and family connection that she didn't genuinely feel. According to Riley, she'd rather struggle financially than feel pressured to maintain a relationship that felt forced and uncomfortable. That conversation ended with Riley saying she hoped I could live with destroying her future over my wounded ego. She said Dennis might not have money, but at least he loved her without conditions or expectations of gratitude. I told Riley she'd get exactly what she wanted, a relationship with Dennis uncompromised by my involvement. She was free to build the family dynamic she preferred, just without my financial support. Riley left my office, and I haven't heard from any of them since. Harvard classes start Monday. As far as I know, Riley still doesn't have funding secured. Part of me wonders if she'll show up anyway, hoping financial aid will cover the gap, or if she'll have to defer and find alternatives. But honestly, I'm not losing sleep over it anymore. Riley made her choice. Dennis made his choice. Linda made her choice. They all decided that removing me from the family dynamic was worth more than Riley's Harvard education. I'm just giving them what they asked for. Update 2. You guys, I honestly didn't think the situation could get more intense, but here we are. Harvard started on Monday, and Riley didn't go. The family is completely falling apart, and I'm getting blamed for everything, while also discovering just how deep this whole mess really goes. First, thank you to everyone who's been following this disaster. Some of you called me an asshole in the comments, and honestly, I get it. But after what I learned this week, I think you'll understand why I'm not backing down. So Monday came and went. I kept checking social media to see if Riley had somehow made it to Cambridge, but there was nothing. No excited freshman photos, no dorm room setups, no Harvard posts. Just radio silence from someone who'd been posting about Harvard daily for months. Tuesday morning, Linda's mother called me. Riley's grandmother has always liked me, even after the divorce. She was crying and begging me to reconsider. She said Riley had been devastated all weekend, that the family was in crisis, and that I was the only one who could fix this. But then Riley's grandmother told me something that made my blood run cold. She said Riley had been getting calls from Harvard Financial Aid all week because they needed documentation of my withdrawal. Apparently, when I notified them that I was no longer sponsoring Riley's education, Harvard required official confirmation and paperwork to adjust her financial aid package. Here's the thing nobody told me. Riley had listed me as her primary financial sponsor on all her Harvard paperwork, not as a family friend helping out, not as supplemental support, as her primary sponsor. Her entire financial aid package was calculated based on my income and assets, not Linda's or Dennis's. When I withdrew my sponsorship, it didn't just remove my contribution. It invalidated Riley's entire financial aid application. Harvard couldn't process her aid package without new financial information from her actual parents. Riley would have to reapply for financial aid based on Linda and Dennis's income, which would take weeks or months. Riley's grandmother said that Riley had been trying to fix this all week, but that Harvard's financial aid office required extensive documentation and verification. Even if Linda and Dennis could somehow prove they had the resources to pay for Harvard, the paperwork process meant Riley couldn't start classes on time. This hit me differently than I expected. I thought withdrawing my support just meant Riley would have to find other funding. I didn't realize she'd structured her entire application around my sponsorship. By pulling out at the last minute, I hadn't just removed my money. I'd made it impossible for her to attend at all this year. Riley's grandmother begged me to call Harvard and restore my sponsorship, even temporarily, just so Riley could start classes while they figured out alternative funding. She said Riley was willing to take on massive debt if necessary, but she needed time to arrange it properly. I told Riley's grandmother that I understood the situation was difficult, but Riley had made her feelings about my involvement very clear. If she wanted Dennis to be her primary father figure, then Dennis needed to handle the financial responsibilities that came with that role. Riley's grandmother got quiet and then said something that changed everything. She told me that Dennis had been bragging to the extended family for months about how he was going to pay for Riley's Harvard education. He'd been taking credit for her acceptance and telling people he'd figured out the funding through connections and hard work. According to Riley's grandmother, Dennis had been actively discouraging family members from congratulating me or acknowledging my role because he wanted everyone to believe he was handling Riley's education himself. The family actually thought Dennis was paying for Harvard. They had no idea I was the one providing the money. This explains so much about the family dynamics I'd been confused by. When relatives praised Dennis for supporting Riley's education, they genuinely believed he deserved the credit. When they criticized me for abandoning Riley, they thought I was walking away from a supportive role, not from being her primary financial sponsor. Riley's grandmother was shocked when I explained that I'd been planning to pay the entire $280,000 for Riley's education. She'd assumed I was contributing maybe $10,000 or $20,000 as a family friend, not funding the entire thing. Dennis had led everyone to believe he had the Harvard costs covered. After that conversation, I started getting calls from other family members who'd just learned the truth about the funding situation. Riley's aunt called crying and apologizing for calling me bitter and cruel. She said she had no idea I'd been planning to pay for everything and that Dennis had been taking credit for my financial commitment. Linda's brother called and said he was furious with Dennis for letting the family attack me when I was actually the one making Riley's Harvard dream possible. He said Dennis had been acting like the hero father who was sacrificing to pay for his daughter's education, when really he was contributing nothing. But the call that really got to me was from Riley herself on Wednesday night. She was sobbing and could barely speak coherently. Riley said she understood now that I hadn't just withdrawn support. I'd made it impossible for her to attend Harvard this year at all. Riley begged me to understand that she never meant for this to happen. She said she thought rejecting my ongoing involvement in her life was different from destroying her education entirely. Riley insisted she never wanted to hurt me this badly and that she was willing to do anything to fix the situation. I asked Riley what exactly she thought withdrawing funding meant. Did she think Dennis actually had $280,000 sitting around? Did she think Harvard would just wait indefinitely for payment? Riley admitted she'd assumed there would be more time to figure out alternative arrangements. Riley said Dennis had promised her for months that he had the Harvard funding handled. She thought my money was supplemental to whatever Dennis had arranged. When I withdrew my support, Riley expected Dennis to step up with his promised funding, not for the entire financial foundation of her education to disappear. This conversation revealed just how completely Dennis had manipulated everyone. He'd convinced Riley that rejecting my support was about family loyalty and independence. He'd led the extended family to believe he was funding Harvard himself. He'd promised Riley that my withdrawal wouldn't affect her ability to attend. Riley said Dennis had been telling her that my funding came with too many emotional strings attached and that accepting it would damage their father-daughter relationship permanently. Dennis convinced Riley that the healthy choice was to reject my money and let him handle her education as her real father should. But when my funding actually disappeared, Dennis had nothing to replace it with. He'd been bluffing the entire time, hoping either that Riley wouldn't reject my support or that I'd continue funding her education regardless of how the family treated me. Riley was devastated when she realized Dennis had been lying about having Harvard funding arranged. She said Dennis kept saying he was working on it, that he had leads on scholarships and loans, that everything would work out. But by the time Riley realized Dennis had no actual plan, it was too late to restore my sponsorship for the fall semester. Riley begged me to help her salvage this situation. She said she'd learned her lesson about taking my support for granted, and that she'd never again let Dennis interfere with our relationship. Riley promised that if I helped her get into Harvard for spring semester, she'd publicly acknowledge my role and refuse to let Dennis take any credit. I told Riley that her promises meant nothing to me at this point. She'd already proven that family pressure could make her turn against me completely. Even if I restored funding and she started at Harvard, what would stop Dennis from poisoning her against me again in a few months? Riley insisted she understood now how much I'd been contributing and how Dennis had manipulated the situation. She said she'd never let herself be used against me again, but I pointed out that she'd been an active participant in rejecting my support. Dennis might have influenced her, but Riley had made the choice to publicly dismiss me as manipulative and inappropriate. The conversation ended with Riley saying she knew she'd made terrible mistakes, but that destroying her entire future was too harsh a punishment. She said she was 19 years old and hadn't understood the full implications of rejecting my support. I told Riley that actions have consequences, and part of being an adult is living with the results of your choices. She'd chosen Dennis over me, family loyalty over gratitude, and independence over accepting support with strings attached. I was simply respecting her decision and letting her live with the outcome she'd selected. Since that call, I've been getting messages from Linda saying Riley is falling apart and that I'm destroying a young person's life over adult pride and hurt feelings. Dennis has been alternating between angry calls where he blames me for sabotaging his family and desperate calls where he begs me to help Riley because he can't bear to see her suffer. But honestly, I'm done being manipulated by this family. Riley made her choice when she publicly rejected my support and called me manipulative. Dennis made his choice when he spent months working to turn Riley against me. Linda made her choice when she allowed Dennis to undermine my relationship with Riley because it was easier for her. They all wanted me out of the family dynamic. They wanted Dennis to be Riley's primary father figure without interference from the ex-husband. They wanted to be able to reject my involvement while keeping my money. Well, they got exactly what they asked for. Dennis is now Riley's only father figure with all the responsibilities that entails. Riley has the independence from my support that she claimed to want, and I'm finally free from a family that saw me as either a useful wallet or an unwanted intruder, depending on what they needed at the moment. Riley will probably end up at a state school or community college, which isn't the end of the world. Plenty of successful people didn't go to Harvard. Maybe this experience will teach her something about gratitude and the real cost of family loyalty. As for me, I'm considering what to do with the $280,000 I'd set aside for Riley's education. Maybe I'll finally take that European vacation I've been putting off. Or maybe I'll find a scholarship program for kids who actually appreciate the support they receive. Either way, I'm done being treated like a convenient ATM by people who resent my existence in their lives. Final update. It's been 6 months since my last update about the Riley-Harvard situation, and so many of you have been asking for a final update. I've been putting this off because honestly, writing about this family drama was exhausting. But I figure you all deserve to know how this mess finally played out. Quick recap for anyone just joining. My ex-stepdaughter Riley got into Harvard. I promised to pay the $280,000 for her education. She publicly rejected me as family and called my support manipulative. So I withdrew funding right before classes started. Her dad, Dennis, had been manipulating her against me while taking credit for funding he didn't have. So where are we now? Well, Riley didn't go to Harvard. She ended up at our state university on a partial academic scholarship. Dennis and Linda managed to scrape together enough for in-state tuition, but it required Linda taking on extra debt and Dennis finally getting consistent employment. The family dynamics have completely shifted. Riley's grandmother, who originally begged me to restore funding, now barely speaks to Dennis. She told the whole extended family about how Dennis had been lying about paying for Harvard while sabotaging my relationship with Riley. Most of Linda's family has essentially cut Dennis out of gatherings. Linda's brother was particularly brutal about it. He told Dennis that watching him destroy Riley's Harvard opportunity through jealousy and manipulation was disgusting. The family sees Dennis as the reason Riley lost her chance at Harvard, not me. Dennis has been trying to rebuild his reputation by claiming I was always unreliable, and he never trusted me to follow through on funding. But too many family members now know the truth about who was actually planning to pay. His credibility is shot. Linda and I had one final conversation about 3 months ago. She admitted that she should have shut down Dennis's campaign against me from the beginning. Linda said she was afraid of conflict with Dennis and hoped the situation would somehow resolve itself without her having to choose sides. Linda acknowledged that by staying neutral while Dennis poisoned Riley against me, she essentially enabled the destruction of Riley's Harvard opportunity. She said she understands why I won't restore funding, even though she thinks I'm being unnecessarily harsh. The most interesting development has been Riley's perspective change. About 4 months ago, she started at State University and apparently had some kind of wake-up call about what she'd lost. Riley reached out through Linda, asking if we could meet to talk. I agreed to meet Riley at a coffee shop near her campus. She looked different, more mature, maybe more aware of consequences. Riley started by apologizing for how she'd treated me and saying she understood now how badly Dennis had manipulated the situation. Riley explained that being at State University instead of Harvard was a daily reminder of the opportunity she'd thrown away. She said watching her classmates talk about their college choices made her realize how rare and valuable my support had been. But what really struck me was that Riley wasn't asking for money. She said she wanted to understand why I'd been willing to support her education in the first place, and why Dennis had been so threatened by our relationship. I told Riley that I'd genuinely cared about her success and had seen her as family, but that her rejection of that relationship had been devastating. I explained that being called manipulative and creepy for supporting someone I loved had made it impossible to continue. Riley said she understood now that Dennis had convinced her my support was about control rather than genuine care. She said Dennis had painted my involvement in her life as inappropriate and had made her feel guilty for accepting help from someone outside her immediate family. Riley asked if there was any way to repair our relationship, not for financial reasons, but because she missed having me in her life. She said Dennis had convinced her that cutting me out would strengthen their father-daughter bond, but instead it had just left her feeling isolated and unsupported. I told Riley that I appreciated her apology, but that trust, once broken, was incredibly difficult to rebuild. She'd proven that family pressure could make her turn against me completely, and I wasn't willing to put myself in that position again. Riley accepted my response and said she understood why I couldn't trust her anymore. She said she hoped someday I'd be willing to have a relationship with her again, but that she wouldn't pressure me about it. That conversation gave me some closure, but it also confirmed my decision to maintain distance. Riley may understand now what she lost, but the damage to our relationship was too severe to repair. As for Dennis, he's been struggling with the consequences of his choices. His relationship with Riley has actually gotten worse since Harvard fell through. Riley blames him for destroying her opportunity, and their interactions are strained and awkward. Dennis tried calling me a few months ago to suggest we work together to get Riley into Harvard for next year. He said we should put our differences aside for Riley's sake. I told him that Riley was his responsibility now, exactly as he'd wanted, and that he could handle her education without my involvement. The extended family situation has been the most satisfying part of this whole mess. Everyone now knows that Dennis sabotaged Riley's Harvard opportunity through jealousy and manipulation. His reputation as a father and family member is permanently damaged. Riley's grandmother specifically told me that she was ashamed of how Dennis had behaved and that she understood why I'd withdrawn support. She said Dennis had destroyed his own daughter's future to protect his ego, and that the family would never forgive him for it. Linda's family has essentially sided with me in this situation. They see Dennis as the villain who cost Riley her Harvard education through petty jealousy. When I show up to family gatherings, people are friendly and supportive. When Dennis shows up, the atmosphere gets tense and uncomfortable. The money I'd set aside for Riley's education is still sitting in my investment account, growing steadily. I've thought about donating it to scholarship programs, but honestly, I'm enjoying having the financial security more than I expected. I've also been dating someone new for the past few months. Sarah is a teacher who has her own kids from a previous marriage, and she's been incredibly supportive about the whole Riley situation. Sarah says she can't imagine letting someone manipulate her children against a person who is genuinely trying to help them. Having Sarah's perspective has been really valuable. She's pointed out that my relationship with Riley was actually quite healthy until Dennis started interfering. Sarah says that Dennis's behavior was a textbook example of parental alienation, and that Riley was essentially a victim of his manipulation. But Sarah also agrees that I made the right choice in maintaining boundaries. She says that continuing to fund Riley's education after being publicly rejected would have sent the message that my feelings and dignity didn't matter. Looking back on this whole situation, I think everyone got exactly what they asked for. Riley wanted to prioritize her relationship with Dennis over accepting my support, so now she has that relationship without my financial involvement. Dennis wanted to be Riley's primary father figure without competition from me, so now he has all the responsibilities that come with that role. Linda wanted to avoid conflict between Dennis and me, so now she doesn't have to deal with that tension because I'm no longer involved in their family decisions. And I wanted to be treated with basic respect and appreciation for my support. When that didn't happen, I removed myself from the situation and found peace. The only person who really lost in this situation was Riley, and that's unfortunate. But she was an adult who made her own choices about how to treat someone who was supporting her. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are permanent. I don't regret withdrawing my funding. Riley's treatment of me was unacceptable, and continuing to support her education would have sent the message that she could reject me personally while keeping my money. I wasn't willing to be treated like a convenient ATM by someone who resented my existence in her life. Dennis got what he wanted, to be Riley's only father figure, but he also got the responsibility that comes with that role, including finding ways to fund her education and career goals. He can't have it both ways. The family learned some hard truths about Dennis's character and priorities. His willingness to destroy his daughter's future to protect his own ego showed everyone who he really was. And I learned to value my own dignity and self-respect over trying to maintain relationships with people who don't appreciate what I bring to their lives. 6 months later, I'm at peace with how everything played out. Sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who take you for granted, even when walking away has serious consequences for them. Riley will be fine at State University. Dennis will continue being the father he always was. Linda will keep trying to manage everyone's feelings without taking real stands. And I'll keep living my life surrounded by people who actually value and appreciate me. Sometimes that's the best revenge of all, just being happy without them. Edit. Thanks for all the support in the comments. To answer some common questions, no, I haven't heard from Riley since our coffee meeting. Yes, Dennis is still trying to get family members to pressure me into helping. No, I'm not changing my mind. Yes, Sarah and I are doing great. This is my final update on this situation. Time to close this chapter and move on.